right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to my talk. I'm Kevin Chen from Nuclear Fishin Software. We recently made a game called Horsemen, which is a game about the immigrant experience. And one of the very unique things about this game is that your protagonists are immigrants, and they can come from any of 12 different countries. And the game plays out very differently depending which country they're from. So because this is a game about the immigrant experience, and because it's really easy to make something like this feel really hokey and inauthentic, it was a design priority for us from the very beginning for the story of the game to kind of feel like it reflects the lived experiences of people who have gone through similar things in real life. And this is a very context-sensitive thing. There is no sort of universal, culturally neutral immigrant experience. That's kind of anathema to the entire idea. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we tried to accomplish that. So one of the major rules of storytelling for any kind of story, digital or otherwise, is to know your audience. And 10 years ago, when I was a creative writing student at Oberlin, one of the best pieces of advice a professor ever gave me is stay away from the vague. The way you talk about universal themes, ironically, is to make things as specific as possible. Like, people care a lot more, for example, about a specific Syrian refugee than refugees in general, because that's a very abstract concept and nobody can completely relate to that in the very abstract sense. So we kind of explored what makes stories believable for a particular culture and how we could adapt the game's overarching, there's four main storylines, how we could kind of make those feel specifically, culturally specific to each of those countries. And I mean, as an example of how players kind of bring the cultural context they're in into the game. Some of you might be familiar with Saints Row 4, a game that lets you play as a black lesbian president of the United States. And this is really funny to Americans because that seems so implausible given the sort of all of this social obstacles it would take for someone like that to be president. Somebody who isn't coming from that context wouldn't appreciate that at all. So when I get asked to talk about this kind of thing, usually they ask me to frame it in terms of representation. And after giving a couple talks on that subject, I've kind of realized that it's not really enough. You can't just be like, oh, I can play as a member of my own race and then drop them in this weird culturally neutral environment and have it feel realistic. And the reason why is because there's a sort of dysphoria to doing this. I mean, sometimes it just works. If you look at the images on the right, those are 3 different playthroughs of the game. Some things you can kind of adapt the same experience to 3 different contexts. You just swap the colors around. But some stories really don't actually work in all contexts, and if you try to translate them, it's hilarious. The Metal Gear Solid series is infamous for really being a samurai movie kind of thing, more set in a Tom Clancy novel. And this feels really odd to people who are familiar with the American military experience, but it's to Japanese audiences might not get that at all, and we're kind of trying to avoid that a little bit. So the easiest way to do this is through language. I mean, this is really easy to do poorly. So we put a lot of thought into this. The most basic way we do this is through a system called code switching, which is something that international students and bilingual children around the world do naturally, which is that they will speak their adopted tongue, but certain idiosyncratic phrases and turns of speech and swear words and such that they use in their native language. And this is really easy to do technically, on a technical level. And I am a third culture kid. I grew up abroad, despite being born American. So this is something I am intimately familiar with. And I mean, one of the things I see in a lot of books about, well, a lot of stories about that are translated from other languages. Everyone speaks this very neutral sort of mid-Atlantic English. And it lends the writing gravitas, but that makes the people not feel like new people, real people. Nobody says mother, I will go to the village today and fetch some water. So a danger in this, in that no matter what country you pick, the kids all kind of sound like Americans. And I was kind of wary of this in the beginning, but I realized, again, going back to specificity, I am writing this for I did make this game for an English-speaking audience, and a particular kind of English that is real is going to feel more authentic and emotionally real to people than something that's designed to be neutral. And also, there's no way I could have done this just from research. I did a ton of research and read a lot of books, went on the internet, spent ages deep diving into lots of things. But I could not have made this game without the help of friends I had many, many conversations with who grew up in foreign countries, telling me, like, what does a 16-year-old actually sound like? And this was crucial to like doing this project. Like, this would be so hokey and like not feel real at all if I hadn't done that. So the way this all kind of came together, we ended up accidentally making the most sophisticated profanity system in video games. And this is actually really important in us on a social level because a profanity kind of like, it exposes the what is transgressive to a particular culture's values and very, very succinctly. And by sort of demonstrating those transgressions in the form of uh, profanity, it makes them more authentic. As in, kids only swear around other kids because it's forbidden to do this around other adults. And yeah, it's weirdly very, very humanizing, even though the whole point of cursing at someone is to dehumanize. So I have an example of this and how we use it in the game. The block at the top is how the script is actually written, and the game like automatically fills in the words with a lexicon that we built for our different fictional but based on real life countries. So that's on a sort of like micro level. On a macro level, to make the themes of the game kind of feel relevant to a particular political context. This is the hard part, the big picture stuff. Is you kind of really have to understand every single culture that you're writing, like their politics, their myth, and their history. All the sort of like foundational tales that shape someone's expectations and their lived experience, and how a player expects their choices will go when they make them in a game. So I mean, we kind of focused, like a lot of people will read like ancient mythology and religious texts and so on. We did a little bit of that, but a lot of little things in everyday lives, like TV commercials, what restaurants are popular or whatever, like these will shape people's lived experiences and make someone feel like they're inhabiting a particular culture, far more than that. So we focus on the modern more than the ancient. And we worked it into the game in a lot of like really subtle ways, both in narratively and mechanically. Like, for example, if you're from a community if your character is from a community that's historically been marginalized, then there's like grinding the economic system is a lot harder. So it incentivizes those players from those cultures to find like different solutions to their problems, as we're more used to. There's one character who's a Maoist in the Green Isles and a religious fanatic in 11th, reflecting those places' particular histories. And there are religious themes in the game that are actually dependent on the character's religion, and they all interpret the story of the game differently, which I think was a lot of fun to write. So these are all reflective of systems of values of ethics, which are really complicated, but for the purposes of this game, we managed to distill this into a 3-axis system. I won't sort of like list them all out, you can all see them, but the words of the same color in pairs, those are opposites. And so each country can only have one of those one of those words from the 3 pairs. So I mean, the way this works in practice is like, for example, there's a part in the game where you get mugged, and if you punch the mugger and you are living in a individualistic, assertive, like discipline-focused country, this is seen as an act of heroism because you're standing up for yourself. But in a country that's more collectivist and values humility and personal autonomy, this is seen as an attack on the culture itself by an outsider, and you might actually attract a lynch mob. So because it's really hard to do this through context, and because just like in real life, there's a lot of situations where you can't really read what the culture is until you mess up, and then the mistake can be fatal. We did put a system where the kids can go to school and then pick up cues on what their culture is. And the big central challenge of this game actually is learning what that particular culture of the country that the game takes place in is like, and then trying to adapt that culture, just like the immigrant experience in real life. So this sounds very like technical, but it's actually like very intuitive. We've had players play the game and say it feels like pretty realistic. So yeah, that is basically my talk. For Horsemen is out on itch.io, and I'm working on the paperwork to get it through Steam. It was recently greenlit. You can find us at nuclearfishin.com/forhorsemen, and thank you for coming to my talk.